All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Military Museums. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Some of you know me. I see some familiar faces. For those who don't know me, my name is Dave Peabody. I'm the manager here at the Military Museums. And one of the great perks of my job is that we get to host fantastic events like this, where we get to hear a lot of very interesting perspectives on various topics from times past to current events. Before I carry on, a couple of quick housekeeping points. If you don't know already, the washrooms are to my right and down at the end of the hall. Please put your cell phones on mute if you haven't done so already. And then all this food has to be gone by the end of the night. So once we finish up with the formal portion, feel free to hang out, chat. I'm sure Dr. Huebert will be available. Eat all the food while you're doing that. All right, so I would like to acknowledge that the University of Calgary and the Military Museums, located in the heart of southern Alberta, pays tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. So, if you're here, I'm assuming that you follow current events and you're aware that there is a war currently in Ukraine. If you're not aware of that, come talk to me after and I'll fill you in. But in the not so much in the background, very much in the foreground of this conflict, there's been a lot of talk about nuclear weapons, and these come up every time we discuss maybe providing more powerful arms and munitions to Ukraine. Well, what if the Russians decide to use nukes? This is quite a change from the past 30 years or so. I remember as a child growing up in the 70s and 80s thinking about nuclear weapons, and even then the risk was not what it was back in the 50s, 60s, and talked about as much. But it was there, and then it was gone. We were in an era of disarmament, and where the concerns were more about these weapons falling into the hands of non-state actors and what the consequences of that might be. But in the past couple of years, things have taken a dramatic turn, and nuclear weapons are very much back at the forefront of security policies. Different countries are looking at procurement and expanding their arsenals and methods of delivering these. That's about where my expertise on the subject ends. So fortunately, we have a much more knowledgeable and proficient guest with us tonight, Dr. Rob Huebert, who will be giving us a better talk than I could ever give on nuclear weapons. So Dr. Huebert, for those who do not know him, is a professor of the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. He has served as the Associate Director of the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies and is now the Acting Director, which I'm not sure it will be acting for too much longer. That part of the title will be removed. He was appointed as a member of the Canadian Polar Commission, now renamed Canada Polar Knowledge, for a term lasting from 2010 to 2015. He is a senior fellow with the Laurier MacDonald Institute, a fellow with the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies, and is a research fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He is taught at Memorial University, Dalhousie University, and the University of Manitoba. He publishes on the issue of Canadian Arctic security, maritime security, and Canadian defense. His work has appeared in International Journal, Canadian Foreign Policy, Isuma, Canadian Journal of Policy Research, and Canadian Military Journal. He was co-editor of Canada and the Changing Arctic, Sovereignty, Security, and Stewardship, Commercial Satellite Imagery, and United Nations Peacekeeping and Breaking Ice, Canadian Integrated Ocean Management in the Canadian North. He also comments on Canadian security and Arctic issues in both the Canadian and international media. And 20 years ago, he was actually one of my professors at the University of Calgary. I had the pleasure of learning from him firsthand in one of our seminars. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Rob Huebert to take the mic.
Well, thank you very much. It is indeed an honor and a privilege to be able to share some thoughts on what I understand to be one of the most existential threats that the international system now faces. Not Canada, not the Western world, but the world in total. It is a threat that in many ways we are sleepwalking towards. As David said in his very kind introduction, there is a changing environment. The only slight provision, I would say, in terms of David's very astute introduction to the topic is that these forces that are now leading us into a new nuclear era have really been in effect since at least 1999, if not even predating that. To a large degree, a lot of the factors that we see coming forward in 2023 are in fact long-term impacts. And this is the part, of course, that in many ways terrifies me the most. Because it's not something that we are just sort of happenstance happen to be occurring, but rather that in fact that what we are seeing is a series of very carefully thought out decisions made by the major powers that are now interacting with each other in a way that without any hyperbole could lead to the end of the world. And so I think it's imperative as us, as the thinking public, to be able to start thinking about these very critically important subjects, to understand that in fact that what we are seeing beforehand will be remembered as the beginning of a new era, and perhaps even a new terrifying era in terms of how we are going ahead. Now, for many of you that will, of course, recognize some of the work I've done, some of the students here, you'll know that my major focus of research is on Arctic security. And in fact, you may ask, well, why are you talking about nuclear weapons? And also, just let me put the footnote in. Yes, I mispronounce nuclear all the time. I've got a slight speech impediment, and nuclear is just one of those damn words that has to be in the middle of what I do research on. And I know, yes, it's like the way George Bush says it. Don't worry, I have enough people tell me that I do that. So, in the issue of full disclosure, I mispronounce it. I know, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to live with it for the next 50 minutes as I'm talking about it. Anyway, so as we start thinking about the subject matter, as I start thinking in terms of the Arctic, of course, is where so many of these core issues are occurring, and it's the fact that it's in the Arctic is why so many of us are unaware of what's happening, because it's out of sight over there and nobody's paying attention. And that's really led me into considerations of what is happening. So why is this such an important? Why do we have to start thinking about the unthinkable? Why do I say that now we are entering into this era? Well, let's be clear. Nuclear war, yes, I said that word with the mispronunciation. Nuclear war means the end of humanity. It means that because of the energy that is released from the nuclear weapons themselves, the radiation, the heat, the blast, all of that will kill substantial. But we also have an appreciation now that any, even regional conflict poses a risk of what we refer to as nuclear winter. In other words, basically, even if the war is only in the context of, say, the Indians and the Pakistanis, or between the Iranians and the Israelis, that ultimately, because of what we now understand in terms of what will happen in terms of the fallout, but more important, the impact on the ionosphere, we know that we will break the agricultural cycle with any large-scale utilization of these weapons. So in other words, it could be happening over in the Indian subcontinent, but our agricultural in Canada will be destroyed. And then the question becomes, how long does it take before we can start growing again? How much food do we have on store? And so this is when we have to acknowledge the existential nature of the threat. We have to be fully cognitive That we're not just talking about the blast damage. We're not talking about the cities and the societies that will be blown to smithereens, but we are talking about basically the type of destruction that science fiction tries to capture but doesn't really do a good job. Now, why talk about it now? Well, why talk about it now is that we are literally engaged in the largest scale modernization of our nuclear forces since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and possibly even larger than what occurs at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. When we just look at the major nuclear powers, the United States, China, and Russia, each of these are now investing in and once again, we run into difficulties of getting exact figures, but in the next 10 years, it is estimated that we will be spending between $1.5 to $2 trillion. Think of that, trillion, in terms of what is happening. We have new technologies, we have new numbers that, quite frankly, if we spend the time to think about it, should, of course, baffle us in the overall context. We also have, beyond the capabilities that are being invested in, we are also seeing a major rethinking of the strategies of at least the Americans and the Russians. Now, it's much more difficult to get any understanding of what the Chinese are thinking, and so we're left trying to look at their capabilities and trying to assume a lot. They are not as forthcoming, obviously, as what the Americans definitely are, and definitely not what the Russians are. But we are also, and it goes back to David's point about the Ukrainian crisis, we are also seeing political leaders again threatening to use nuclear weapons to a degree that we have not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, was the point where everybody realized just how disastrous nuclear war would be, and we started seeing most of the leaders walking away from at least talking about the use. Well, that has changed. That has definitely changed since the second phase of the Ukrainian war. We hear Putin continuously using that as a threat. And so we have capability, strategy, and comments. Now, the third element is that we are in a new geopolitical environment. I mean, we may wish it away, we may call it something different, we may say, let's just not look at it and maybe it's not happening. But we clearly, since at least the arrival of Putin as leader of the Russian state, we have a much more assertive Russia. We see that with the Chechenian wars, with the Georgian wars, and with the Ukrainian wars and the Syrian intervention. They are assertive. I don't, once again, that is not to be pejorative, but that we can see it just in terms of the action. We have a China that is much more assertive. We have a China that had a defense budget in 1989 that was less than that of Canada's. We now know, of course, that China is catching up to the Americans, and there are some that fear by 2030 that we'll see China on par if they, of course, don't have an economic meltdown. There's some people saying that is a possibility right now, but if they don't have that economic meltdown, they may catch up to the Americans and be on par. And that means going from a $20 billion defense budget in 1989 to a $600 billion defense budget, because that's where the Americans are now. And if we're being fair on the issue, we have an aggrieved United States. We have to realize that as much as we hope and pray that the Americans remain within our system, sharing our values, being there to ultimately protect and backstop the security of the Western system, their political system is under great strain. And we see this right across the board with ramifications that are not even clear. I mean, to think that the American Senate would be unable to actually agree on the promotion of his senior leadership because of one senator who is determined to stop it is only a mere indication of the very dysfunctions that we see in certain elements of the United States. So why do we have to think about the unthinkable? Herman Kahn, who is one of the leading thinkers during the period of the initiation of the Cold War, reminds us on his book, Thinking the Unthinkable, Fighting Thermonuclear War, that to ignore the subject matter is to only make it worse. To ignore the subject is basically to abandon ourselves to whatever directions misfortunes may take us. Now again, for those of you that have not been able to get through his 400-page book, you could read the Knowles condensed version of it, and that is go rent the movie Dr. Strangelove. because the reality is he plagiarized, what Huebert did was he plagiarized Kahn's book. The guy in the wheelchair, by the way, isn't Henry Kissinger. Everybody saw it in the movie. It was Henry Kissinger. That was actually his caricature of Herman Kahn. Herman Kahn was a pretty hefty guy and had troubles getting around, and so therefore picture it. But everything that Herman Kahn talks about, thinking the unthinkable and the dangers of what that entails, Stanley Kubrick did an amazing job of capturing it in Dr. Strangelove. In fact, it was so accurate. I still, in my strategic studies class, my students get to watch that after we talk about nuclear war and strategy in the class, just so they can have a quick version of Herman Kahn's thinking. The problem we face now in the Western world, in Canada in particular, there's very few people that are thinking. We have some individuals. We've got, for example, Eric Roulet over from RMC. It just has a book that we're publishing at the University of Calgary on deterrence. We've got a friend and colleague, Richard Simala, who's here, who does think about these issues. But the number of Canadians who actually thinks about nuclear war and deterrence is a minuscule compared to those that think about the economics, think about the culture change, think about the other issues that are important. But again, it's very difficult to find those of us that will be thinking about this issue. And so, what are we talking about? Well, there are three core concepts that we need to understand before we can talk about where the problem is today. The first one, and I want to make it very clear what I mean when I say nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence, and once again, it went out of fashion as the Cold War wound down. But nuclear deterrence has never stopped being the #1 security protection and existence of the international system since 1961. Now, I use 1961 because that was the time period of the Cuban Missile Crisis when both the Americans and the Russians realized, or Soviets realized, nuclear war was unwinnable. All it meant was the total destruction of each societies, and so therefore something new had to be thought of. Victory was no longer a possibility. And so what is nuclear deterrence? Well, nuclear deterrence is about yield and delivery. It is the combination of having a new explosive capability that in nanoseconds can destroy a city. We've always been able to destroy cities. The Romans showed that with the destruction of Carthage. It took them 3 wars to be able to do it, and it took them 3 years once they defeated Carthage and decided to destroy the entire city. Tokyo was destroyed to a level that was more extensive with higher casualties than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we can destroy cities. We've always been able to do so, but we've never been able to do it in a nanosecond. But the critical part that comes into that is we've never been able to do it with a delivery system that is undefendable. With the German inroads into rocket scientists and the fact that the Soviets and the Americans made sure that they got their hands on their equivalent of the German rocket scientists, once you had the marriage of the nuclear warhead, instantaneous destruction of a city in a nanosecond, with a delivery system that cannot be stopped. Even today in 2023, even with the most state-of-the-art American Patriot system, Americans are very open. They can't stop a majority launch of Russian missiles as it stands. They know that they will get through. So in 2023, you cannot defend against it. And so that marriage of yield and delivery system meant that we changed the international system. There was the realization that you could not fight and hope to win if you were a major partner within the system. Minor states, yeah, you could still have wars. Israel and the Arab states could still have the series of conventional wars. India and Pakistan, war still happened. But nuclear deterrence meant for the first time in our existence, the major powers thought that they could not fight each other to victory. And so that changes the thinking, that changes how we approach. And basically what happens is everyone says, as long as we have the ability to maintain the ability to kill after we're dead, that's what mutual assured destruction is about. As long as the Russians know that we will still send our missiles and they will die with us, the war won't start in the first place. And that's the essence of nuclear deterrence. And that's why it's called MAD. Because you sit there and you think, my God, if you can agree that it's so terrible, we'll never do it in the first place, why do you get yourself into the circumstances where you have those weapon systems to exist? And of course, that is one of the great questions we have today. Now, the second issue that we have to look at, and this becomes an issue under the administration of Ronald Reagan, is nuclear defense. Nuclear deterrence is based on the assumption that you don't really do anything to stop your enemy's weapons to come in. You assume your enemy's weapons are going to have their own capabilities of coming in. So that's always there, but you don't add to it. Well, Ronald Reagan changed that dynamics. He changed it. He said after he saw a movie about nuclear war called The Day After, which is a very frightening movie. If you haven't seen it, you should see it because everybody says it's dead on for the accuracy. But The Day After showed what was going to happen if deterrence failed. And so Ronald Reagan launches the Americans on what becomes known as a Strategic Defense Initiative, commonly referred to as Star Wars. But the critical point here is that Ronald Reagan introduced the idea that you might be able to defend your society. You might be able to have a system in which you can protect against a nuclear attack. The problem with that, though, is, of course, if you are the enemy, all you are thinking about is that the Americans were trying to have a system that they could launch their missiles into Russia and then have the shield by which to protect what remained in the Soviet arsenal. And so the Russians saw the logic as ultimately a first strike capability. They did not see it as a means of defending American society. And of course, this is where the argument always comes in. This is the argument of those of you who say we should never ever join the Americans in the anti-ballistic missile system, that we are undermining deterrence. And the problem is, it does. But the problem is, once the genie was let out, once the Americans started putting money into the SDI, then you had both the Chinese and the Russians doing two things. You had them, of course, looking at their own SDI systems about how to do it, and once again, we don't know where the Chinese stand on this because they are so secretive. The Russians, we don't think, have made much progress on that. But more importantly, it creates a perception that nuclear deterrence is not the core, that it's not the mutual assured destruction, and it starts putting into the minds of decision makers, is there a possibility in which we could see a reality of engaging with nuclear weapons? And once again, it's a psychological factor that comes in. Now, the third element that we have to be clear on is actual nuclear war fighting. Throughout the 1950s, we saw several instances that we came very close. When the French were being defeated in Vietnam by the Viet Cong, they made repeated pleas to the Americans to provide tactical nuclear weapons to relieve them from their siege in Dien Bien Phu, and basically they had no problems in asking for the Americans to use nuclear force. We know that the reason why MacArthur, besides the fact that he was acting treacherously against his president and disobeying orders, but the other major reason was he wanted to use nuclear weapons as tactical war fighting. So in the 1950s, there were still people thinking that a nuclear weapon was simply a bigger bomb. That they were thinking in the context, okay, we destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the B-29, but we destroyed Tokyo with the B-29. It just took us longer to do it. So what's the difference? And so there is that mindset. But we broke it with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis so alarmed American and Soviet leadership, they said, no, this is different. We've got to get away from that. But the question of where we have to be paying attention to is when we hear Putin offering scenarios where, in fact, there is an argument to be made for utilizing those forces. Now, that's to save a Russian defeat in the face of Ukraine or any of the other bases of his threats. Now, is he just doing it as an empty threat, or does it go beyond that? And that's, of course, the question of our day, of being able to determine. But the idea that you can actually fight and achieve an outcome with nuclear weapons, it was something that we thought had ended in 1961, but obviously Putin's statements remind us that leaders at least will threaten to do it, if not if they're actually seriously thinking about it. Now, where does it go for the modernization, and how do we start thinking about it in that context? And why do I say that we're facing such an amazing modernization? For those of you that follow the numbers carefully, the Adams, the Richards, that I know are sitting there and saying, okay, what numbers is he going to say in terms of where we stand? We are, in fact, in 2023, we're at the lowest number of nuclear weapons that we've ever seen. We were in 1987, we were at the highest number, and that was approximately about 80,000 weapons. That's why when people say destroy the world 5 times over, try to name 80,000 cities in the world. And so you sit there and say, okay, so you got a nuclear bomb for each city. Now, of course, some of those were tactical weapons, some of those were in storage, so it's not really that you had 80,000 city-busting bombs, but you had enough to do it. And with nuclear winter, you would have been doing it. And so where we stand right now, the numbers are that Russia right now is at its lowest number ever, and that is about 5,889, 6,000. There's different ways of counting it, but they're around that number from a height of where they were about 40,000 during the worst days of the Cold War. And out of that number, about 16,000 are deployed, 1,600 are ready to be deployed for action. Now, here's the kicker. The Russians tell us officially that they have modernized 91% of those systems. And so, you know, do we take them at their word? Possibly. It's hard to say. But what we can observe, though, is, of course, that we see that the Russians, starting in 2002, initiate a series of new delivery systems. They've bragged about it. The Americans have reported on them, and some of them are the Poseidon torpedo. This weapon is designed to basically go across the Atlantic Ocean and explode in the harbors of eastern North America and destroy the harbor. Do the Russians have it working? There are suggestions that they haven't, but they're trying to do it. They have a new ICBM, Sarmat. It's what's going to be the replacement of their existing ICBM, which is called, the NATO code word is Satan for it. Now they're having a new one, which is going to be apparently harder to detect, faster. They have a hypersonic Avangard. Once again, can we detect and defend against it? Huge debate about it, but it still represents a new system. They have a Skyfall nuclear-powered cruise missile. They've been having troubles. That thing keeps exploding every time that they try to test launch it. But again, we're talking about the longer-term development, Zinkar and Zircon. So from 2002, when we can trace most of these systems starting, the Russians have had an intent on improving both their deterrent capability, but the problem is when you start looking at some of these others, you start saying those are tactical, those are war fighting. If you're trying to get stealth and if you're trying to get around the American ABM system, the Patriot systems, which several of these are clearly designed to do so, is that really deterrence? And so this is where the problem comes in. We look at China. China basically built up to 300 nuclear weapons relatively quickly, and they stayed there. They had a strategy of limited deterrence. They said, you know what, we're not like the Americans and the Soviets, but 300 nuclear weapons mean that Russia or the United States, if you attack us, it was never officially against the Soviets, but it was. If you attack us, we have 300 weapons, and we will hurt you so badly that don't do it in the first place. And they stayed at 300. As I would add, the British and French also stayed at about 300. The problem is that since 2019, they have now, according to American reports, gone up to 500, and the same American reports say that probably about 2025, 2026, they're going to go up to 1,000. And there are indications that the Chinese are now abandoning their limited deterrent posture for one of equality with the Americans. That's what the Americans are telling us. So we have to be a little careful whether or not the Chinese are actually doing it, but it's pretty clear that the Chinese have changed their position on their nuclear weapons. We saw no movement until 2019, and that has changed since that point. We also can see that in the context of the delivery systems, we see the Chinese building new forms of deterrent. So they are building a new submarine to carry it. The Type 96 is going to be replacing the Type 94. But they are also developing a series of hypersonic missiles that are, according to General Van Herk, who is the former head of NORAD, we can't defend against, we can't detect, we can't really respond. And if you sit there and say, okay, if you put a nuclear weapon on something that we in the West cannot detect, cannot respond to, does that change the equation of deterrence? And of course the answer is, yeah, it does. But how do we understand it? Well, this is what we need to be thinking about. Now, we look to the Americans. The Americans have the lowest number of nuclear weapons that they've ever had. In 2023, they are at the lowest number. They have approximately 5,500 with about 1,800 that are deployed for instantaneous use. But here's the kicker. We look at what the Americans are doing in both terms of policy and in terms of procurement. In policy, they start to re-examine their nuclear deterrent programs in 2018. So they have a document that comes out in 2018. They have another document that comes out in 2019 about their nuclear defense systems. And in 2022, they have a very powerful document that starts hinting about how to have actual responses to nuclear war fighting. Again, they don't put it in that terminology, but Chapter 4 of the report talks about how do you maintain deterrence against these new weapon systems that the Russians and Chinese have, and failing the deterrence, how then do you respond? Well, anybody with any intelligence knows that when you are saying responding, you're saying, how do you do the war fighting? How do you engage if, in fact, the Russians and Chinese do, in fact, break away from deterrent, utilize these new systems, and overcome our defensive systems? Once again, from a psychological perspective, we see where the Americans are trying to get their thoughts. But here's the kicker. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the United States is now committed between 2023 and 2030 to spend $600 billion on their nuclear deterrence modernization. The money is going into four major areas. It is going into a rebuilding of their nuclear submarines. This is Columbia. Now, this isn't being planned. They're building it. One Columbia submarine is almost 80% of the Canadian defense budget for any year. In other words, the estimated cost of one Columbia is going to be approximately about $14 to $15 billion. They're planning to build 10. They've got 10 on order, and they expect that they really want to get 14 to match their existing fleet. Now, will they get up to the 15 given how expensive they are? Who knows? But they are dedicated to the 10. The Americans are also in the process of rebuilding their ICBM bases, and this is a very important considerations for Calgary because these bases are spread. There's three main ICBM sites. There's one right underneath Winnipeg, there's one that basically is underneath us, and there's one that goes a little bit souther that's sort of underneath Regina. And if these bases are ever hit by a Chinese or Russian threat, the fallout with prevailing winds mean basically all of us will die of radioactive poisoning without even having the effects. And so what the Americans are doing right now is they are in fact building a new replacement to Minutemen. It's called Sentinel. And they're building it. It's not that they're thinking about doing it or they're planning to do it. They hope to have the first one deployed somewhere around, I think it's about 2026. So in other words, they're in the phases of rebuilding that. The Americans are also building a new bomber, the B-21. Again, building on the B-2 stealth technology. That one is expected to come into service probably in about the next 5 to 7 years. So huge amounts of money are being spent. We don't talk about it, we don't focus on it, but these are starting to take up greater and greater proportions of the American defense budget, which tells you what they are thinking about. So you then add the fourth one, which is a new air-based cruise missile that is going to also be able to be nuclear capable. You look at the F-35, which is nuclear capability, and you look at the fact that the Americans are also developing new dumb nuclear bombs. When I say dumb, it's not precision guided. It's basically you put the bomb just like in the old World War II movies, and they carry by the F-35s to come in. Every F-35 is designed to carry this type of capability. And so we see the Americans doing strategic deterrence, but we also see them building up war-fighting delivery systems. And so we see a dynamic. We see the Russians starting this modernization in 202. We see the Chinese rethinking of how they are going, and now we see the Americans this is about 212 that the Americans get serious on this, and it's by about 218 that the Americans then dedicate themselves to the new expenditures. It's happening. It's not planned. And so we see this modernization going forward. That is, of course, something of a scale that we haven't seen before. Now, I haven't talked about the minor nuclear powers, but recognize Britain is about to embark upon the modernization of its nuclear deterrent forces, which is based in their submarine forces, which is, of course, is building a new class of submarine, the dreadnoughts. Now, the dreadnought needs to be based, of course, in basically Scotland. And again, we have fun thinking of fun. That's a terrible word. But again, think in terms of how world events are going, because remember, once the British accepted Brexit and pulled themselves out of the EU, what did Scotland start saying? Oh, maybe we should separate from Britain, right? And so you start seeing these connections, because if, in fact, Scotland was to pull out, then all of a sudden the basing of British deterrence comes under question. Where, are they going to have an agreement with Scotland? Is Scotland going to say, hey, we're going to separate from you, but yeah, we'll keep your nuclear deterrent here? That's not going to happen. And so, once again, we see these dynamics. We see the fact that there's evidence to suggest that there were interference in the British vote, that there were MI5 and the CIA have written reports saying, yeah, it was Chinese and Russian influence that ultimately pushed part of that vote. Not all of it, but some of it, enough of it to achieve. And so we see this all being connected in this particular context. And we see the different ways that, in fact, that we're moving forward. Now, there will be some of you who will say, yes, but Professor, there is an international, multilateral, bilateral system that has been in place since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, convinced the Americans and the British, or Americans and the Soviets, that for nuclear deterrence to work, they needed to have a series of international agreements that allowed them to stabilize their nuclear forces. They realized that left on their own, they're going to be in an arms race, even if they say they're doing nuclear deterrence. And so what the Americans and the Soviets engage upon is a series of treaties by which they try to add stabilization. None of these treaties are about the elimination of nuclear weapons. And in fact, when you look at SALT I, which is the first one really to make a difference, it actually said to the Soviet Union, you need to increase the number of weapons you have to match that of the Americans, to achieve stability, to know for certain that you are an equal to the Americans. And so we have SALT I. That then leads to SALT II, which says, okay, now we have to address the technology. We have the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which was in effect to say to everybody else who did not have nuclear weapons at the time, you can't build them, but we promise we'll look at getting rid of ours. Of course, nobody ever really did that in that context, but it did stop many countries from moving forward and delayed the development, we think, in some. We also had a recognition by the Americans and the Soviets that nuclear defense led to destabilization of nuclear deterrence, and so therefore a treaty was signed, the ABM Treaty, that said you can't really develop ABM. Don't develop ABM, don't have the defensive system. And so there is an actual treaty about that. And so we have a series of treaties that say we need to stabilize. When the Cold War ends, we do get, through the initiatives of Gorbachev, we do get treaties that actually reduce the number of weapons. And these are, of course, START I, START II, START III, and New START. So we do have a series of efforts to say, let's get rid of these terrible weapons. START I helps the Americans and the Soviets to get rid of many of their tactical and older systems. So the numbers start coming down from 80,000. We start seeing it come through. The problem that starts occurring is as the relationship between Russia and the United States becomes more problematic, both countries find reasons to walk away from these treaties. So we know that the Americans initiated the pullout from the ABM Treaty. That is no longer in existence. We know that both the Americans and the Russians have more or less determined that New START will stop, which means this lowest number that we have now reached is now going to end. We're going to start seeing the numbers going up again. That's what everybody is saying. We know that the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty has ended. And in fact, if you look across the whole spectrum of nuclear treaties that were there, bilateral and multilateral, almost every single one of them is now either stopped or being ignored. And so you can't turn around and say we have this liberal system, this liberal international order that at least provides us with an international means of containment, that keeps it stabilized. We've removed that. Now, once again, I ask you as reasonable people, you see the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians investing in these new systems. You see the elimination of any international requirement to restrict it. What is going to be the logical outcome of this? And even if no one is truly thinking about nuclear war fighting, what this means is that you can fully expect to see that the number of weapons that are in existence right now, the 1,500, 1,600, and 300 that the Chinese, Russian, and Americans have, that is going to be as good as it's going to get. In other words, expect to see the numbers creeping forward. It won't happen that quickly, but it will be happening in my estimation. And so, where in terms of the modernization does this ultimately leave us? Well, there are three possibilities we have to acknowledge from a logical perspective, from an analytical perspective. One, despite the huffing and puffing of Putin, despite the concerns of the Chinese going from 300 up to 1,000, the essence of nuclear deterrence will be maintained. It will be an expensive maintenance. We will see brand new delivery systems, but the essence of the belief that nuclear war is unwinnable will persevere. And so what that means is that what starts in 1961 will continue. We'll turn around and say, okay, maybe we could have slowed it down, maybe it's problematic, but as long as the three great powers believe that they can't win a nuclear war against each other, we'll simply see the maintenance of an international system that says, yeah, you know, if you're a non-nuclear state, you can expect to see war. If you're a nuclear state, you're not going to have a war with another nuclear state. That has been the essence of the protection of the security of our system. And that may be maintained. Okay, so I'm not discounting that what we may be seeing is simply a modernization. But there is the second possibility, and this is because of weapon technology. There is the second possibility that the main powers will still believe in the maintenance of deterrence, but the new technology, the hypersonics, the Poseidon, the Avogards, the American air-launched cruise missile, all of these weapon systems that in fact we can understand because of the stealth and the speed by which they can deliver will create incidences in which we unleash the genie. In other words, one of the greatest fears that we had was that some incident would see the use of weapons and therefore then escalate. Unintended, but unintended because of technology. Or the possibility that one of the regional nuclear powers, India, Pakistan, India, China, Iran, Israel, will ultimately see the conditions by which they feel they have to defend their existence with nuclear weapons. That then has a spillover effect because we have these delivery systems, that we go to the assistance of the particular countries that we are in favor of, and that then escalates. So that is also a possibility. The third possibility that we have facing us right now is a reshifting of the international system where the core understanding is that nuclear deterrence says nuclear war is unwinnable, and therefore we should not be even thinking about fighting, that the thinking changes to nuclear deterrence has to be the core concept, but nuclear war fighting is a possibility. That we have a Russia that says, okay, I'm going to be overwhelmed by NATO resupply in Ukraine, so I'm just going to use a nuclear weapon regionally within the Ukraine and basically call the bluff on the West. Are the West going to respond? Or China that gets to the level where its amphibious capabilities can move in quickly, and they're not at that stage yet, but where they have the amphibious capability where a lightning strike on Taiwan can happen. And then as a demonstration to the Americans, they then launch an attack on, say, Sasebo or Curzon or any of the other bases, not necessarily on American sites, but on the Japanese or South Koreans, to basically say, you don't cross that line, this is how serious we are. Now, these are not scenarios that I've made up. These are what I've drawn from Rand, from others who are thinking about the issue in terms of what is a reasonable ability. But here's the kicker. If they're thinking about how to fight with nuclear weapons in a scenario, if Rand, if any of these other think tanks are doing it, you know that the governments of China, of Russia, and the United States are thinking. I'm not suggesting that they're thinking in terms of, okay, how can we do it? But the moment in Herman Kahn's thoughts, the moment you move from thinking the unthinkable to thinking it is thinkable, you have drastically increased the probability. Again, We look at the dependence on the rationality of our key decision makers. We're saying, okay, ultimately, Putin, Biden/Trump, depending on the electoral, Xi, have an understanding that nuclear war is unwinnable, even with the new technologies, even with the new delivery systems. If you can say across your heart, say, yes, I believe all four of those, believe that nuclear war, given whatever weapon systems are coming forward, whatever develops, is unwinnable, then you make me sleep a little bit better if you have that type of belief. If you turn around and say, well, I don't know if a Putin, if a Biden, if a Trump, if a Xi actually thinks that, or that they have scenarios that they say, yeah, I can get Taiwan this way. I can put the cost up and basically make the Americans call my bluff. I have the capability now. Is that a possibility? And so we see that as shift. Now, out of these three scenarios, the maintenance of nuclear deterrence and nuclear deterrence alone is by far the safest for us. Isn't that the paradox? You know, you create trillions of dollars of expenditure and you hope that that works the best. The slippery slope, a regional conflict, we can't control what the Indians and Pakistanis are going to do. We can't control what the Iranians and the Israelis will do. And so you can start seeing, okay, that slippery slope one, that escalation one, that's kind of a scary one. But the scariest one is the moment that the political leaders of the three powers start thinking, you know what, there are scenarios. And so that becomes the possibility we need to think about. I would argue that that's by far the lowest probability going into the next 10 years, but it is not, once again, going back to Herman Kahn's terminology, it is not unthinkable. And so the question is, how do we prepare? How do we think about it? Well, from a Canadian perspective, there are about four things that we need to be thinking about. Traditionally, Canada has always been a major supporter of the international treaty system. In other words, we had a long-standing legacy of being taken serious. It was a bipartisan agreement. It didn't matter if you're talking Pearson, Diefenbaker, Mulroney, Chrétien, Trudeau. Our diplomats tended to play an important supporting role. We were never leaders in it, but we could be counted upon being major engagements in terms of the international legal system to provide stability. Now remember, for START is the only treaty system that reduces nuclear weapons. All the rest are about stability. And we played our role, we played that role. But, as I've just pointed out, that system doesn't exist anymore. We don't have an international legal system at all governing anything to do with nuclear weapons. Now, you know, maybe New START might be revived. I doubt it, not given where we're going in this context. And so that used to be a useful role. The other question we have to ask is how many people now take Canada serious in our ability to be diplomatic? Are the Indians going to do it? No. Are the Chinese going to do it? No. Are the Russians going to accept us? No. We've given too strong a support to the Ukrainians. Do the Americans take us serious? Well, once again, very difficult to see that. So that's probably problematic. The second thing that we can do is to support efforts to have the deterrent system maintained. Now, as long as Xi, Putin, Biden/Trump believe they cannot win and the system support them, that seems to be the greatest probability that this new modernization will not change the system fundamentally. But what do we have to do? Well, Canada traditionally has played a critical role in deterrence. And once again, this is my experience as a Northern security analyst. It relays with the DEW line and the subsequent North Warning Line. Those were critically important to the Americans to have the confidence that they knew that the Russian missiles were coming so that they could fire their missiles in time so that we could all die together. Now, again, you know, it does sound funny when you say it, but that is basically what we were doing, was basically saying, you know what, as long as everybody knows that, as long as the Russians know the DEW line works or the North Warning system works, you know, they're not going to launch in the first place. The problem is, of course, is that Canada has not updated its contribution since 1985. Yeah, we've made small pieces, and I have to be very careful because I know, the former commander of Northern Areas here, and he's going to correct me on any mistakes that I make on this issue. But the reality is that the updates to the North Warning System have been incremental. And according again to General Van Herk, who was the commander of NORAD, have not kept up with the hypersonic capabilities that are now there. Now, we said in June of 2022 that we were going to take that. Well, actually, let me step back. The government, to its credit, did say in 2017, with strong, secure, engage, we needed to do this. So they did acknowledge it, something that we often don't see governments doing. They did acknowledge it in 2017. In June of 2022, we had a very fulsome program of progress brought forward by the then Minister of Defense and by the Chief of Defense Staff, in which they outlined several issues such as over-the-horizon radar, development of a missile system for our aircraft, and a series of other contributions that would make a truly meaningful impact on NORAD's ability to detect. The problem is, though, of course, is are we being good on that? Now, there's a huge controversy right now. What does $1 billion that the government has now taken away from D&D, what does that mean? Some people say the government is still managing to go forward on NORAD modernization, and that's a possibility. We have to acknowledge that. But you take $1 billion away after saying that you needed to do this, and you acknowledged what it was going to cost, because the government was straightforward. It says it's going to cost us about $40 billion to do it. And, that's probably a conservative pricing, but at least they were willing to say that. The question is, if you're taking $1 billion away now, how are you going to get that done and get it done in time? And so the question then is, are we really supporting deterrence? Do the Americans see us as a critical part, or even more critically, do our enemies, and I'll use that terminology, enemy, do the Chinese and Russians have confidence that the systems that we have in right now will in fact detect their missile launches? Do we have the ability to detect their submarines? And of course, the question is probably not. Because remember, on the NORAD modernization, we did not talk about underwater maritime capabilities. Now, we might be doing it secretly. I fully acknowledge that. But the underwater dimension, trying to deal with the Type 95s of the Chinese submarines that will carry cruise missiles and presumably hypersonic cruise missiles, doesn't look good on that aspect. And so the question is also, we see our Nordic allies developing what I would argue is a Nordic form of NORAD within NATO. Since 2016, 2017, the Finns, the Swedes, the Danes, and the Icelanders have all entered into new agreements with the Americans. They do it under a Nordic agreement. It's called Nordefcom. And what they have done is they've created an integrated aerospace protection. Now, it's not as comprehensive as NORAD yet, but it is my belief that Nordefcom will ultimately provide a NORAD form protection for the Nordic countries. Canada is not involved with that at all. We are not participating with them. And so one has to ask the question, given the new types of threats, do we not now need to join any type of aerospace protection that NORAD provides with what NATO is now creating within this? And this would be something else that I think that has to be seriously considered. The third aspect, and this is one that is so politically sensitive, do we have an understanding of how to respond and how we have responded to national crises? Because should nuclear war occur and should there be any impact on Canadian soil, we need to mobilize the most of our capabilities if we're going to provide any type of survivability. And I ask you this, in the face of the post-COVID crisis that we faced, how have we done in terms of government's willingness to engage on something akin to a royal commission, an examination of how well or how badly we did it at a federal, territorial, provincial, and rural capability? Do we have those studies? Have we sat back and said, what are our lessons learned? Where did we do it well? How did we come together? Did we react fast? Because remember in the COVID, remember the period from January to March. The outside evaluations are that we were frozen in place. We did not respond. And so in the face of something in which, and remember, and I remind my students always, COVID goes from being zero to the third largest killer of Canadians in that 2-year period. So cancer and heart disease still remain the two highest means by which Canadians died. But if you look at the statistics, COVID and COVID-related deaths becomes the third. And so you sit there and say, okay, have we had that ability to reevaluate what we did right and what we did wrong? And of course, we know the answer. We know that what the politicians have done is they have politicized the response to COVID. We know that, you're either going to be taking the conservative or the liberal view, but you're not going to be taking the analytical view. And if we can't do it for COVID, how can we get our minds wrapped around what is necessary to respond? I mean, imagine, one of our cities actually getting hit with nuclear weapons in this type of scenario. They're on their own. We're not going to be able to have the 5 C-17s come over, assuming that there's still survivability in that time. So, okay, you're on your own, but what does that mean? What happens if we do take a limited hit? What happens if we lose half of our hospital capabilities within a city? Once again, I think back to COVID. The hospitals were hit by COVID. We had to take the precautions, but they were still there. And so the question really now is, are we capable of a society of thinking the responses that we need to? It is akin, of course, the metaphor is used in terms of a fire insurance policy. Most of us will fortunately never face having our house burnt down, but you can't have a half-ass fire insurance. You can't say, okay, you know what, I only need to pay for 50% because let's keep our premiums down. You need to either replace it or you don't, and so forth. In our preparation, we need to be rethinking about it. So this brings me to my conclusion. We are entering truly a new era of nuclear weapons. Full stop. The money's being spent, the technologies being developed are there. And like I said, I've only talked about the 3 major nuclear powers. It's here, it's happening. It's something that we don't want to address. It's something that we don't want to think about. We in academia are just as guilty as the politicians and the greater public. We're not thinking about this. When's the last time you saw a good op-ed talking about the coming new nuclear era? When have we had any discussions on any points of this that I've raised? And as I said, you can fact check everything that I have said. You can go and have a look in terms of Sentinel. You can go look at Poseidon. You can go look at Avangard. You can look at the policy statements of 2018, 2019, 2022. You can look at the 2020 document that the Russians have. These are all in existence, and we need to put them together instead of looking at singular individual items. And so the question is how do we proceed going into the future? Now, hopefully, this is just a continuation of nuclear deterrence. Isn't that a terrible thing to say? That hopefully the best case scenario is one in which the agreed that we all have mutual suicide at the same time is our best guarantee of security. But the problem is the other 2 scenarios. The new weapon systems and escalation are a possibility, are increasing with hypersonics, with these type of systems that are coming in. And the scarier one is we're starting to see the first signs that people are thinking about nuclear war fighting. And that should terrify each and every one of us. And I'll be honest, I don't know what the answer is to that. But I do know that we need to start thinking about it. So thank you very much, and I hope that I've given you some pause of reflection, and I'm happy to take questions. We have a mic, so just if you want a question, put your hand up.
Okay, I'll take the mic for a second. Mary, this is for you. All right, so thank you very much, Rob. Very interesting. Really enjoyed your talk. So you mentioned Dr. Strangelove. I will quote Dr. Strangelove, one of the great scenes from the movie. The Americans are deliberating about what they do, and the general or the president says, "Gentlemen, this is a war room. You can't fight in here." In in the vein of that quote, we always ask at the military museums that you keep your questions respectful, keep things civil. By all means, ask challenging questions, but let's keep it polite and have a productive discourse. All right.
It would not be a talk if we did not have some form. And just think, for deterrence to actually work, we need to have every system work perfectly within a 20-minute bracket. Because remember, for deterrence to work, your decision maker will have at most maybe 10 minutes to be informed that the missiles are coming, to probably another 5 minutes to basically give the order. And what we do know in the open literature is that, particularly with the ICBMs, it's going to take them about another 5 minutes. So your technology has to work perfectly in each and every one of those instances. And you also have to have your mics turned on in that. So.
Yes, thank you very much. And that was great. I actually did read Herman Wouk's book, cover to cover. One thing, I'm incredibly old, so I happen to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis was 1962.
Yes, thank you. I knew someone was going to do that once. But notice I stayed consistent. I knew that I'd made the mistake with 61, and I thought if I stay consistent, no one will note it. But thank you for calling me. I think there's one over here.
Please put your hands way up. If you're like this, we probably can't see.
Thank you. What did the agricultural cycle look like after Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Yeah, in that context, because the fallout was actually relatively limited, what we have to remember, as traumatic as Hiroshima and Nagasaki were, for those two cities, they were small bombs. They were they were above tactical level, but the overall yield levels are at the lower end of what we see now. And so it's hard to know for certain what the overall agricultural impact was, because Japanese society at that point was so destroyed by the conventional bombing, it was hard to make any form of assertion that there was something separate in terms of the fallout effect as opposed to the massive B-29 conventional bombings that had occurred. So it's very difficult to know because of those two factors.
Okay, thank you. So part two of that would be the talk now for the type of nuclear bomb that Russia's threatening to drop would be very small scale, even in comparison to those. Would that still have an effect on the agricultural cycle?
Probably it would destroy it. Once again, and I know I'm getting into the roots. Yeah, exactly. Just to get a thought of probably what it would look like, and it's only probable. Think in terms of what happened to agriculture in the region following the Chernobyl crisis, because the output of a small bomb would be roughly akin to that, but it depends if you're doing a ground burst or if you're doing an air burst. If it's a ground burst, it's going to be much worse. If it's an air burst, you kill more people, but you don't get as much fallout. So it depends on the type, size of the bomb. It depends on what it looks like. Those become questions in terms of depends on wind. If you have no wind, it limits it. If you have a huge wind going on, that's where the problem comes in. So we just simply don't know with any certainty.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just wondering what is, conventional weapons have improved immensely themselves. In the case with Ukraine, Putin has threatened tactical weapons. Right now, we're supplying Ukraine with conventional weapons, but NATO has not put any boots on the ground. Could that be the deterrent? You know, if Russia used a tactical nuclear weapon, we just say, well, you do that, we start sending in our troops. Would that be suffice?
There are some analysts who have said that conversation has already occurred. And once again, this is where the secrecy comes in. do the Russians know that there is a threshold? And see, this gets back to another major element of nuclear deterrence. You need to have the rules established of what is acceptable behavior and what is not acceptable behavior. That's why, after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, was of course so important to get that red phone, to get that communication, so that the Americans and the Soviets could say, look, US, you can go after the Viet Cong, you can go after the North Vietnamese, but you cannot hit the supply units or supply cities that are in China. That's off limits. And likewise, there were similar conversations during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Do we have that in existence now? And that's, with the breakdown of communications, this is one of the things that we are most fearful of. Do we have an understanding with Putin on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable? But then the problem is, what does victory look like in a conventional sense? So you may have these discussions in terms of what's acceptable for nuclear capability, but the problem is when you get this dual-use delivery systems, they'll start blurring into each other. They start becoming fungible. And when that happens, the distinction between nuclear war fighting and nuclear deterrence starts to become problematic. And once again, we go back to Herman Kahn, identified that this is where the delivery systems are so critical for our understanding of the maintenance of it.
So we talked a lot about today about deterrence when states have nuclear weapons. So how should we, as a global community, approach states like the Islamic Republic of Iran, who have made statements about not only wanting to acquire them, but use them against Israel? So at what stage should we have a policy response, like a new joint comprehensive plan, or a military response to prevent them from even having nuclear weapons?
Yeah, excellent question. Because it's, this is the type of conversations that are so difficult. Because on the one hand, we say the more that Iran makes these threats, and remember, it's Iran making the threats against Israel. Israel only makes the threat saying, if you attack us, we will attack you in response. They're following the rules of what is deterrence. They have never said anything beyond that. And so if we accept that as our starting point, then the next step is, okay, what do we do to ensure that a country that is threatening to actually instigate a nuclear usage or usage of nuclear weapons, what do we do to stop them? Well, you then have the alliance system that is going to be gathering against Iran. This is a horrible answer. In other words, we're saying, okay, can we talk it through? Can we use negotiations? Can we just talk the Iranians down out of it? The problem is, if they're serious about it, no, you can't do that. Then you have to ensure that you have the working alliance against the Iranians, so the Iranians know that the cost to them for doing that is so high, you can't do it in the first thing. Oh, logic of deterrence. And so you have to take the steps. For Canada, you have to actually call Iran an enemy if you are thinking that you have to take this type of steps. Remember, CSIS releases reports in terms of security threats to Canada. If you read the CSIS reports, and they're always vectored by the federal, by PMO, PMO will not let them say anything except for what is in the public domain. In other words, you will not find in any of the CSIS reports about the enemies we face. We will see China named and we will see Russia named because it's based on open sources. You'll never see Iran, but it's becoming apparently clear that we are very aware of the Iranian operations within Canada. And so part of the problem is you don't want to alert your enemy that you're on top of them. On the other hand, if you have a Canadian community that says, well, Iran, we've never talked about them as an enemy. So if you're not having even that discussion, that limits your ability for us as a society. For the Americans, for the Israelis, they have to ensure that the Iranians understand any use of nuclear weapons will then acquire unacceptable losses in Iran. Now, here's a kicker. What happens if you have a society that believes that even at the risk of the loss of their own society, they are achieving a greater good? Now, this was the fear we had in the 1990s with individual terrorist groups that we were fearful, particularly the fundamentalist groups, of acquiring nuclear weaponry of some way or another, usually from the Russians. That fear has gone down because it has proven so difficult for them. In fact, if you look at Hoffman or any of the writers on this issue, they think, okay, that's not so much of a problem. But it still is predicated on the assumption of rationality. You know, whoever you are in control of Iran, can you be convinced that it is unthinkable. You will lose. You will, even if you eliminate Israel, you will be eliminated at the same time. And you've got to convince them. And that's, how do you do that? The ring, you have the counterintelligence against them. You target any of their terrorist groups. You say they're a terrorist group. You say they are a threat. That's something in Canada we haven't done it. We just simply have not identified the Iranian threat at this point in time on that basis. And so does that undermine our ability to convince the Iranians greater? I don't think they really pay too much attention to Canada, but if other countries are like us, then of course that becomes problematic.
So you mentioned earlier how important it is to have your microphones and other critical systems working during nuclear confrontation. And when we think about how nuclear powers interact, would having cyber warfare capabilities be escalatory?
You know what? Let's even go beyond that. What does artificial intelligence and the capability of interfering when it's then applied to cyber warfare, the capability to blind a society? Again, what we are seeing in some of the nightmare escalation scenarios is an enemy that either thinks or achieves the ability to blind you. Something that, we can all understand if you explode an EMP burst. That is a nuclear weapon that is designed not to cause destruction, but to send out huge radiation that basically incapacitates our communication system. So we understand that, and that's why the Americans harden all their communication capabilities to avoid that. But what happens with the cyber warfare? What happens with artificial intelligence? One side or the other then thinks that it has the capability of blinding the other for that critical 20-minute period, because that's how fast these things are happening. And so if you can think that you can blind, so take a Russia that has a breakthrough with AI, with cyber warfare, and they think, okay, we can cripple London, Washington, Berlin for a 20-minute period. Well, you basically do your regional nuke in Ukraine or wherever, and then you pre-position all your other weapon systems so that you then say to the Americans, okay, what are you going to do now? You were blind then. How do you know we're not going to blind you again? And so that is another major issue that we need to think about. We need to think what artificial intelligence in terms of the overall ability to control our systems means. A lot of people think it's going to be a good thing because it takes some of the people out of the decision making. But what happens if you can actually infiltrate it? What happens if you start relying on an artificial intelligence system for your systems, and the other side figures out how to use cyber warfare to then affect it? And so once again, you start seeing the unthinkables in terms of what technology is going. And this is another aspect that people are terrified about. What do the new technologies mean in that context? And we have one over here too, Mary.
What is the significance of the number of nuclear weapons in the arsenal? So you mentioned that China is increasing their arsenal from 300 to up to 500, up to 1,000. Why is it so significant when it seems to me that 300 is enough to wipe out every major North American city?
That's precisely the point. The Chinese policy up till now was we only need enough weapons so that we will kill enough of you that you will go down with us. That's why it's called limited deterrence. Now, recognize an attack on China would target their nuclear weapons, so they would lose some. So even out of that 300, it is expected you'd have, 150 left. But once again, name 150 cities in Washington or in Russia. And so that was assumed to be enough. When you start adding weapons, when you start saying, okay, we need more, the question that flows is, what do you need them for? Why do you need them? For the Americans, it was always about triad. We wanted to balance the possibility that there is never a defensive answer against any of our systems. You might figure out how to sink our submarines, but our aircraft will still get through. Or you might figure out how to shoot down our aircraft, but our submarines will still exist. Are the Chinese then adopting a more robust triad? That's a possibility. Are the Chinese also thinking in terms of, do we need then more tactical weapons so that if we launch an attack on Taiwan, maybe use limited nuclear weapons, we still have enough, even if we take some losses, to be able to respond to the Americans? See, it's psychological. But the problem with psychology is what point does it spill over to the actuality? But what we think, what we see within the open academic literature is that the Chinese are now moving into, first and foremost, they want to be a peer equal to the United States. So it's a little bit, the United States has 5,000, so we better have 5,000, which, you know, you sit there and say, okay, do countries actually think that way? And unfortunately, there's evidence to support they do. But the more serious question is, what do you want to do what do you want with those extra 600 or 700 weapons that you're expected to have? Watch. We've got to be watching that, is my contention.
I was going to ask you about AI, and I'm really glad that you addressed that. Just as a minor question, I understand that under the Soviet Union, there were nuclear weapons in the Ukraine, and under independence, they removed them. I don't know of any other countries that have done so, but would that have been a deterrent for the existing situation had they not done so?
Well, this is such a wonderful question. Let's be very clear. At the disruption of when the Soviet Union disrupts, there are 4 countries that then are the benefactory of the nuclear weapon systems of the Soviets. So it is Russia. Russia has the bulk of the systems. There are weapons, major strategic weapons in Belarus. There are major systems, many of their ICBM systems were in, I'm going to mispronounce that, the Southern Republic, Kazakhstan, and the Ukraine. Now, the 4 countries keep their nuclear weapons for about 4 years. They find it is an incredibly expensive. And basically what they find is that if you're going to have nuclear weapons and you're going to keep them away from the terrorists, if you're going to keep them maintained, you have to keep them fresh, you have to protect them. They were finding that it was taking up close to about 30% to 40%. This is according to open literature. I don't know, you know, it may be different, of their defense budget. And so what the Ukrainians, Belarus, and the Kazakhstans all agreed with Russia, we will surrender our nuclear weapons as long as you promise not to invade us. And so there is a signed agreement by which the Ukrainians, the Belarus, and the Kazakhstan give up their nuclear weapons. A few weapons go back to Russia, but most of the weapons are decommissioned by the Americans. So it's an international agreement. The Americans significantly support this and say, okay, we understand it. This eliminates the problem. But we are left with this question today. What would have happened if the Ukrainians had held on to those weapons? In other words, what would have been the Ukrainian response, given how lightning efficient the Russians were in the first phase of the war? Remember, when they invaded Crimea, the Ukrainians were caught totally flat-footed. And so what would be in a scenario, say it repeated itself exactly as how it occurred. The Russians launched the strike. They, of course, do the misinformation for the little green men in terms of eastern Ukraine and pretend it's not them. What's Ukraine's next step at that point? Would Ukraine then launch missiles? I mean, this is the serious thought in terms of, did the Ukrainians really give up something? Because it comes back to the question, was there enough uncertainty by the Ukrainians having those weapons that the Russians never would have launched the invasion in 2014 in the first place? And this is a very serious question that the South Koreans and the Japanese are looking at today. If I dare say, the next 2 countries that will announce having nuclear weapons will probably be those 2 countries. We're seeing movements, even though the Japanese say that they are totally anti-nuclear weapons, we're seeing developments because they are concerned, well, what happens if the Americans pull their weapons out? And once again, Trump had been talking about this. So, anyways, just follow up.
North Korea the wild card in that?
Well, North Korea is very much a wild card because we say, is the great leader, is he rational? And again, we say, is he rational from a state perspective or is he rational from a self-preservation? You know, remember, this is the leader that is allowing his society to starve. You know, and so you say, would he be willing to engage the South Koreans? And that is why the South Koreans are now looking to develop their own weapons, because they don't fully trust the Americans, and they definitely don't trust the North Koreans. And so that's where I get into the regional nuclear warfighting. This is why we need to be watching that. And incidentally, I should add, the American ABM system is designed against, the current intermediate interceptors is not against the Chinese or the Russians. They say, we can't stop them. Even the Chinese have too many missiles. It is against the North Koreans, and I'll add, with I was going to say McDonald, not McDonald, with, what was the liberal minority leader? I'm blanking out. Martin, thank you. Martin was set to join the American ABM system. It's public knowledge, the Globe and Mail released it, and they were correct, but we did have a memorandum of understanding that was negotiated and signed. We were going to be like all of NATO, with us as the exception. The Japanese, the Australians have all agreed to the American ABM system as a means of defense against the North Koreans. Canada is the only country that has said no to the missile defense. And Andrea Sharon at the University of Manitoba has written extensively on this, arguing that under American law, you can't defend a foreign country unless there's an agreement. And so this is where the wild card for Canada even becomes scarier. Oh God, you're wrong, Adam. No.
Thanks, Rob. Actually, coming back to a conversation I had with one of your students today, we were talking about a similar subject. Maybe the one country in the world today, in my view, that could productively add a nuclear arsenal, to my mind, might be Taiwan. We're talking about deterrence, and of course, one of the biggest concerns today for the tinderbox that may ignite a global world war is the invasion of Taiwan. What do you think about that? What do you think of the potential and the risks for the Taiwanese either overtly or secretly gaining even a limited nuclear capability as a deterrent to stop that war that so many people see coming?
Excellent question. I wouldn't expect anything less. If they can get a nuclear weapon, they do reduce the risk that the Chinese will see a first strike environment. And so that does reduce the risk to themselves. But the lesson to be learned is when we look at the Iranian and the Iraqi nuclear programs when facing an existential enemy. And for the Iraqis and the Iranians, the existential enemy always were the Americans. In the case of Iraq, the Americans believed, and once again we can get into discussions about how good their intelligence was, but the Americans believed that the Iraqis were on the verge of getting nuclear weapons but did not. And we see the corresponding fact that the Americans do invade Iraq. They use military force as a preemptive strike in that context. Once again, Bush claimed that as a major element, but regardless if you're saying that they were going to have it right away or longer term, we know from the first Iraq war that they were trying to get it. But the Americans are able to stop it. We look at Iran, who kept their program quite quiet, quite secret, and we now think that they have nuclear weapons, and we don't see a similar American response to them. And the lessons that I think that Taiwan would take from that is if you're going to go this route, if you're going to go for deterrence against China, you got to go the Iranian route. You got to keep it secret, you got to keep it quiet, and then you got to have a fully capable system. And that is very difficult to do, given Chinese intelligence capabilities, as we see in Canada, how effective they've been in terms of infiltrating our systems. And so the Taiwanese have to ensure that if they are going to do it, that they are able to just basically turn the switch on and have it ready. Once again, we can go back to Dr. Strangelove. Remember, they were going to announce the day of the Monday of the Great Parade that they had the doomsday bomb in place. And that was supposed to be a form of deterrence. And of course, it was because it was a Sunday, they hadn't made the announcement. The Taiwanese would probably have that close of a time period. They have to ensure that the Chinese do not see the need for a preemptive strike, but in fact that it would be too late. And so that becomes the critical part. But they have the technology, they have the ability. Now, the question is, would the Americans treat Taiwan the same way that the Chinese treated Pakistan? Because we have pretty good indications that the reason the Pakistanis, Khan, who was the father of the Pakistani nuclear bomb, probably did a lot of stealing and had a certain capability himself. There are suggestions that the Chinese really helped them a lot after the Indians were able to detonate their bomb in 87 or 97. And so would the Americans be willing to take that step? And once again, see where I talk about thinking the unthinkable. What happened, just say for the sake of argument that the United States decides to do in Taiwan what the Chinese did with Pakistan, at least provide enough assistance, what do the Chinese then do to that? And when do the Chinese learn that? So all of these become the reason why I'm saying we need to be thinking about this, and that's why that's such an excellent question.
The increasingly common use of hybrid warfare on the global stage today, especially through cyber warfare, information warfare, and using proxies or proxy forces like non-state groups, has changed the traditional linear ladder of escalation of tension between states since the end of the Cold War. How does that affect the potential for nuclear conflict in the future?
For me, the most dangerous element of the new forms of warfare that we're seeing, and it gets back to the artificial intelligence, it gets back to all these situations, are that scenario in which we stumble into nuclear war. In other words, conventional war is increasing. And so with the hybrid warfares, do we make a miscalculation in Ukraine, in Israel, Palestine? In other words, does an event spiral out of control and we lose the knowledge of what's really happening? And that becomes the critical point in here, because again, deterrence requires that you have that 20-minute window of pure understanding. And if you can blur that, if you can convince yourself or actually achieve through hybrid warfare, through misinformation, through any of these, just to blind your enemy for that 20 minutes, all of a sudden, first strike, even if it's not successful, even if you haven't really achieved it, but if you believe you achieved it, then all of a sudden we've increased drastically the possibility of nuclear war. And so that's where the danger comes in, is the uncertainty. Sure, I'm ready to go. I mean, we still got a lot of drinks here afterwards, too.
Thank you very much for this great enlightenment. I was going to ask you if you could answer the question that you posed rhetorically at the beginning of your talk, because it has to do with what it takes for the general populace to become informed and therefore engaged on the issue. Why don't we have op-ed writers proliferating the airwaves and the media with the importance for all of us to think the unthinkable today?
Yeah.
Why is that not happening?
Well, it's an excellent question, because I even like to push that a little bit further. And Mary, there was a question beside him too. I'll take that one also, where I think it was going. When we think about the unthinkable, the common response is, it's so horrible, we don't want to think about it, so therefore let's not talk about it. But remember, within our society, both at the government and at the non-government level, we are having discussions about the existential threat of climate change. We are talking about what it looks like to see the seashells stop to exist as a society as sea levels go up. We're talking about the warming. In other words, we've demonstrated as a society, we can in fact talk about very uncomfortable terms. We can have substantial debates and disagreements on whether or not even climate change is occurring. And yet we are still having that discussion amongst informed Canadians. We can have disagreements. And so the question comes back, well, why aren't we doing this for nuclear war? Well, part of the answer is that we thought at the end of the Cold War, nuclear weapons had disappeared. We thought that, okay, you know, there's some legacy systems around, but they disappeared. They're not there because we didn't have a dialogue on it. And so therefore, who's paying attention to when the Russians announced that they're going to be developing Asgard in 202? Who's going to be paying attention and trying to understand what Poseidon means? Or who, I would challenge how many people here had ever heard of Sentinel before. And remember, the Americans are getting ready to deploy Sentinel in about 2-3 years. They've been thinking about it for at least 10. So in other words, it's sort of like it didn't really exist, but it existed. So that's the second answer. The third answer, and I take responsibility for this, within the university system, you are seeing a gradual elimination of those programs that will look at hardcore strategic studies. You will see, once again, a preference to go into soft security, constabulary, all the topics of the day, but I'll be honest, trying to get a hardcore strategist hired nowadays. You know, I'm looking at Adam, I'm looking at Richard, and saying these are, you know, leading scholars that we should be bringing in and embracing, and we're not doing that. And I dare say that within the university system, we do no favor to ourselves by ignoring it in that particular context. So we have these three elements that are coming together that, you know, we think that it wasn't a problem. We then can't get our minds around it. And the third one is that those that would lead. Now, I hope, you know, I'm so happy to see so many of my students here from my various classes here that I'm planting seeds, saying this is what we need to be looking at. We need to be understanding. You need to be leading us into the next generation. So I'm hoping discussions like this might begin perhaps a greater conversation.
Come forward, Mary. One more row on your right.
Thank you very much. If you were Prime Minister and politically you could conscript tens of thousands of young people, would you want to do that? And if you did, what would you have these young people do?
Yeah, it's not conscription. It's not the boots on the ground that we need. We need to expand our hiring. In other words, there's no question that the levels that we have within the forces are a criminally low number, but we need specifics. The threat is not numbers. The threat is for Canada is not land. We're not going to be invaded by the Russians or the Chinese anywhere where we need bodies to defend. We need individuals that can man our ships. We need the aerospace and maritime capabilities to respond to this. So in other words, if I was Prime Minister, I wouldn't be looking for conscription. I wouldn't be looking for numbers. I'd be looking for making sure that our procurement is dealing with the threat of 2023 and not dealing with the threat of 1985. I would be looking for making sure that we get our best and our brightest that want to come in that we can then utilize for addressing the question of aerospace and maritime security. Because for Canada, if we're going to protect ourselves against deterrence, that is where we have, or for deterrence, that is where we have to be.
But we're not there, right?
Oh, we're going backwards. We're going backwards. And we're the only NATO ally, by the way, unless maybe you count Hungary. You know, they've kind of under Obey gone backwards. But the Nordics are spending huge amounts of money on this and attention. The British, like I said, Dreadnought is going to be one of the most expensive programs they've ever had. The French, oh, by the way, just so that you know how serious this is, remember, those of you that were paying attention in the news, the French just tested a new ICBM on Friday. So, you know, we're the ones going backwards.
Up to you if you want to take one more.
I'll take a few more. What time is it anyway? I've lost track of time.
Yep, just after you.
Well, let's take a couple more, but I am going to stick here. I need after one of these talks, I always need my rum and Coke.
So, Rob, this has been great, but this is to the point of the gentleman back here, and he asked why the media aren't interested in this. I'd suggest to you that the issues that they are covering extensively are ones that they believe they understand and have an emotional commitment to. Can't speak to the emotional commitment to this, but if you had the opportunity to sit down with the editorial boards of the major newspapers that are left and lay this out for them, what would you have them write about Canada's response to this?
First of all, that there is a problem. There is a real and increasing existential problem. And it's not just something in our imagination. It's not something that is just sort of occurring, perhaps, that they might be thinking about doing it, but it is real and it is here. It's the same type of knowledge. I remember, because I also do environmental security, and I remember the times in the 1990s when no one took the Arctic environmental security serious. And I remember Dave Barber and others, experts on it, saying, yeah, this is happening. We need to talk about it. So you got to, first of all, the recognition that it is a problem. The second part, then you have to be able to say, what are the risks to Canada? What does it mean not having any meaningful understanding of an international, of a coherent national response to the type of crisis that we're talking about, the type of disaster that we're having? Educate them in terms of the differences between deterrence and war fighting, that there is a major difference that we have to be thinking about. and, trying to encourage them to increase the numbers of individuals that cover it. In other words, basically saying you take the Mercedes Stevensons, you take the Murray Brewsters, the ones that understand it, and you need to have these guys training others so that they understand it. I mean, part of the problem is you've got, 3-4 names in all of the Canadian media that show any real understanding of the issues. It's Mercedes, it's Murray. Puglisi always has an orientation, but he does sort of understand the facts, but you stop at that point. Name me anyone else who you'll see as a byline on maybe Tristan as well. And then, so in other words, I think in terms of media people that understand it and can present on it, I'm not even past one hand when I think of the people. And so that has to, there has to be some type of a training, some type of a process. We used to, at the center, have a program of training journalists on doing it. And as the new director, this is something I'm thinking about reinvigorating and sort of talking to Bob Bergen and the others in terms of how we would probably facilitate it, do our part in that context. But that becomes the third leg of it.
Thanks very much. My last job as an Army officer before I became a lawyer, I participated in NORAD's annual exercise in 2010, and that was tied into the Pacific Fleet's exercise at the exact same time. I noticed two things from that, and I was an infantry officer, so this was all new to me. The first thing was the war started on Monday. By Thursday, everybody had run out of stuff. All the conventional forces for everybody, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans, was all gone. Canada ran out of stuff by Tuesday morning. The other thing I noticed was there was a limited nuclear exchange between China and the United States as part of this exercise. So I have a two-part question. One is, our conventional forces are minuscule compared to what they used to be. Does that force us to a situation of using nuclear arms more quickly? And my second question is that limited strike that was even discussed back in the 1980s, is that realistic, or would that never happen? It would always spiral out of control.
Yep. Well, the first answer to your questions, the Russians have answered that. In 2020, they released their document on their nuclear policy. It has been characterized as, in the West, the Russians have never used this terminology, let me be clear, but it's been characterized by many Western analysts as a policy of escalate to de-escalate. In other words, the Russians basically say, we will be the first to use nuclear weapons when these lines are crossed. So the Russians have told us already, yeah, we will. And the thing is the Russians have told us a lot of what they're doing. The Russians aren't shy. I mean, they told us what they were going to do with the Georgians. They told us what they were going to, yeah, Putin says, Crimea will never be a NATO base. We will do whatever is necessary when, of course, the colored revolution was occurring within the Ukraine. And we see that he kept his word. And so I think that we can expect that the Russians do have that policy, that they do see nuclear weapons. And that's why, by the way, they've just announced the largest defense budget ever of the Russian state. And it doesn't quite catch up to the Soviet amounts. It's the largest expense. They think it's about 30% of the overall GDP of the Russian state. And so I think that we can take that very serious in that context. In terms of your second question, in terms of our ability to see, well, remember, this is where so many of the questions that we've had tonight about misinformation and the ability to divide. Look at the way that Canada was even though every single one, even New Zealand was telling us, Canada, you're nuts to let Huawei be your supplier of technology. They will use it as the Trojan horse or the, Battlestar Galactica metaphor. They'll be the they're the Cylons trying to enter your society. And so they told us, and look at how slow we were because of what I think, Wesley Warwick has shown very precisely with his writings on this, that it was a political decision. Canada didn't want to piss off China. And so therefore, we were willing to really hurt how the Eyes 5, the other four, saw us. I mean, when little New Zealand is telling us we're not getting hard security correct, I think it's something really telling about where Canada stands right now. And so that is where the Chinese and Russians will put their money. They'll put their money in terms of trying to have other Weiwall type circumstances in which they can divide us and then just cause that concern of uncertainty and then wean us off. What happens when the four members of the I-5s think that we are a leaky source? What happens when they think that, in fact, that we cannot be trusted? And that's a divide. You know, they'll kick us out. They won't share information with us. And the Chinese and Russians then succeed. It's like what they did with the British. Just give enough of a push to the Brexit movement that you've got idiots like Boris Johnson who wants to do it for political gain. So part of the British voting for Brexit were genuine people who didn't like the EU. But we know that they're getting very effective, just adding enough to go. And that, in my mind, is the real threat, because then that seeds the discord that disrupts our unity that we need. Remember, ultimately, for nuclear deterrence to work, you need to have that solidity of thinking and thought for 20 minutes. You interrupt that, real problem.
All right, maybe we'll take our next questions over rum and coke.
Sounds good.
All right, that was an excellent presentation and an excellent Q&A session. It's been reported by the Globe and Mail, it's in the public domain, that the Chief of Defense Staff in the new pan-domain force employment strategy has clearly said that Russia and China believe themselves to be at war with us. Now, maybe we can debate that. I'm not here to debate that. CDS is my boss, so if that's what he says, I think he's right. But why I mention that is not to make anybody feel worse, but is that this is an important issue. The top soldier in the country sees these security issues as very important, which is why I'm very pleased to see all of you here tonight, because it means you are engaging. You have come to learn, to expand your knowledge about the subject, and I'm very happy that the university has this partnership with us and is able to put on these events and bring Canadians in here and visitors to discuss these issues, to get informed, and hopefully be encouraged to go out and learn more about these. And tell your friends and bring them in too, because that's how change will happen. The more people that are interested and engaged, the better chance we have of actually effecting change and convincing your MPs or your MLAs what matters. The military museums plays a small role in that. For example, our Cold War exhibit harkens back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, when Canadians put their lives on the line to deter aggression at that point and try and maintain peace. These facilities are excellent opportunities for Canadians to learn about what Canada has done in the past and to try and be aware of the security situation now. And then speaking to the questions on misinformation, because really we are in a pan-domain security environment. It's physical, it's intellectual. Academics are being used to spread messages. It's technological. Our social media is being used to spread messages. We're very fortunate that on January 25th, Dr. J.C. Boucher from the university will be here with his topic, Russian Embassy's Conversations Spreading Propaganda on Telegram. So a brief description of this. So in this project, we are exploring how Russia is using the digital space to advance its interest. Russian Embassy's conversations migrated from major social media platforms such as Twitter to Telegram messaging platform that is used as a tool for information operations in the war in Ukraine. Analyzing Russian Embassy's channels worldwide, we examined how Russia uses Telegram to disseminate its propaganda and promote its interests during the Ukraine war. We will analyze what shaped Russia's framing of its official propaganda in the context of the Ukraine war. So if you're available on January 25th, I highly recommend you make it out to hear Dr. Boucher speak. He's extremely knowledgeable on this topic, and it will open your mind as to the extent of the enemy action that is taking place in Canada today and how they are attempting to influence how we think about our society and our institutions, and really that we can't be sleeping on this. So I highly encourage everyone to attend that talk. On that note, on behalf of the military museums, I want to give one final thank you to Rob for being up here for a good hour and a half and giving us a lot of great information, a lot of things to think about. And by all means, please feel free to stick around, have another drink, drown your sorrows, ask more questions. And I hope to see you here again at the museum. Thank you very much.